Greetings to you. We're continuing in Mark's Gospel. Today, chapter 10, verses 1 to 16. We're moving venue. Verse 1, they left that place, or he left that place, Jesus and his disciples left that place, which is Capernaum. They've had their final Galilee session in private. He's finished his public ministry in Galilee some little while ago. Chapters 7 and 8 were Gentile territory, and 9 could be Gentile territory in terms of Hermon for the Transfiguration. Might have been Galilee, Mount Tabor, but in any case, it was a private thing with the disciples. Then after some more private teaching with them in Capernaum, no more public ministry in Galilee. And chapter 10, verse 1, he finally leaves Galilee. Finally, he left that place. It's a strong word. He's gone. Goodbye, Galilee, as far as his ministry is concerned, and until after the resurrection. And he went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Judea is the area around Jerusalem. Ignoring the huge Negev desert, it's the southern part of Israel. And beyond the Jordan, well, the Jordan River runs to the east of what's often described as Israel, but the borders were rather vague then. It's the territory across the river from Jericho. It's territory that those who've been on Holy Land tours or pilgrimages will have seen if you've been to the baptism site at the River Jordan. Then you see what's now the Kingdom of Jordan just over the river. That was the territory beyond the Jordan, and Judea was this side, the western side of the river. But a lot of movement between the two, and national boundaries weren't, as we understand them, policed and tax people waiting to collect revenue and duties and things. It didn't work that way. He's now in the area down the mountains from Jerusalem. It's Judea, sometimes called the Judean wilderness, sometimes the area around Jericho, which could cross over the river. That's where he is. It's not Galilee. It's part of what would now be described as the West Bank or the Palestinian territories, but then was the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Not the same as Transjordan, which is also beyond the Jordan, but is further north. And crowds again gathered around him, and as was his custom, he again taught them. So there is some public ministry now, but it's in Judea and across the Jordan. It's not in Galilee. He's done with Galilee. And that's an important move, because done with Galilee means he's actually on the way to Jerusalem. So this is in the context of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, the way of the cross. And it's also in the context, as we've seen in the last 2 or 3 of these talks, it's in the context of what Mark is setting out as intensive teaching for the disciples, coming between 2 healing of the blind miracles. The first where the man initially can see people but only like trees, and he needs a second touch from Jesus for the full healing. And then the final bracket of this section is the healing of Bartimaeus, which is at the end of this chapter 10. And in between those two, in other words, the last half of chapter 8 and 9 and 10 Mark is bracketing between those two healing miracles as intensive training for the disciples, moving them from half sight of recognizing Jesus as the anointed one, the Christ, but not really knowing what that means, to the final approach to Jerusalem when all becomes clear and the eyes are opened and we know what Jesus is about and what he's come for. So Mark understands all this as intensive teaching for the disciples. And although there's sort of public ministry here at the beginning of chapter 10, the explanation is to the disciples in private. We'll find that in verse 10 of our passage. Then in the house, the disciples asked him again, we don't know which house, a house, the house, wherever he was staying. We know that he often stayed in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus when he was in that territory, but we don't know. It's the house, which is a symbol in Mark for private indoor training for the disciples. So there's a little bit of public ministry, which is initiated by the Pharisees, just testing him. And they test him with one of the big questions of the Jewish religion of that day. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, that was a big question in the day, and what it meant was, we know it's lawful to divorce your wife for difficult Greek word, sometimes translated as uncleanness, almost certainly means adultery. We know you can divorce your wife for adultery, but what they mean is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any other reason? And there were big debates among the Jewish scholars because of this word in the law of Moses, that you could only divorce your wife for uncleanness, whatever that means. The more conservative Jewish scholars took uncleanness to mean adultery. Simple as that, no other grounds for divorce. The more, we might say, liberal Jewish scholars, and there were plenty of them as well, took uncleanness to mean anything that the husband didn't like. Some would go further than others, but some said it even includes spoiling a meal. Anything that the husband doesn't like, or way of behavior, way of speech, how the wife conducted herself, anything that the husband thought was unclean or impure, the more liberal scholars said was grounds for divorce, using this slightly vague word that came from Moses, uncleanness. So the question, as we have it in verse 2, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? If we understand the context and the background of what the Pharisees were asking, they were asking him to judge between the two views, that you can divorce only for adultery, or that you can divorce for any other reason in addition, instead of adultery. That's the question. And a good, be a paraphrase, but an accurate way of putting it would be, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for anything in addition to adultery? If we get that bit of background, we make more sense of the answer. Jesus answered them, verse 3, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her. Yet Moses did permit divorce in the law of Moses. They didn't say for uncleanness. They just said Moses allows divorce. Still trying to trap Jesus, trick him. The Pharisees, who are fairly conservative, want Jesus to come out with something liberal and soft, and therefore to be able to condemn him again. The last thing Jesus does ever is come out with something soft, but there we are. Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this command for you. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." That is not a soft answer. That's a fairly tough and strong answer. The way in which he does it is significant. He goes back beyond the law to creation, and he sees marriage as a gift of God in creation, to quote the Church of England's marriage service. A gift of God in creation. And God made them male and female, and for this reason they're joined together and they leave their parents, they form a new unit, a new creation, one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh. This is a new thing. This is part of God's creative activity, that people who were two become one. This is a new thing. It's God's doing. It's God's gift. Therefore, what God has joined, let no one separate. He's overturning their view of marriage. Their view of marriage was that a man contracted, usually with a woman's father, to take the woman as his wife. That was their view of marriage, that marriage was contracted by the man with the woman's father, and the woman was handed over. And almost like possession. The woman is no longer owned by her father, but is now owned by her husband. That was their view of marriage. And their only question was, does the man have a right to divorce a woman? Can he, having made that contract, decide that's enough for whatever reason? Or are you going to be really strict, Jesus, and say only for divorce? Only for adultery? Jesus says, in effect, you've got it wrong. If you think marriage is a human contract, let's get it into modern terms and stop just saying the man. If we put it in modern terms, the argument from Jesus works the same way. If you think marriage is simply a human contract or agreement, which might be broken as human contracts are, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. If you think marriage is a human contract, you've got it wrong, says Jesus. Marriage is God's idea, God's plan, God's intention, God's ideal. And marriage is solemnized, marriage is brought about. This new creation, two becoming one, is brought about by God, not by man. Sometimes we hear these days, as people talk about the theology of marriage, people saying, well, it isn't the minister or the priest or the registrar or the judge or whoever declares them to be married who's really officiating at the marriage, is it? It's the man and the woman. And the priest or the minister or the judge or the registrar is simply acting as a human agency to rubber stamp their decision. And it's their marriage, their decision, their business, how they deal with it. Wrong. That's the modern human point of view. It's the modern point of view, I fear, for many or most Christians. Marriage is a human contract which can be broken when necessary or reasonable, or it seems right, or whatever. It's intended to be long-term or even lifelong, but realistically it can be broken because it's a human contract. and circumstances change, and contracts can be broken when circumstances change. And Jesus says, no, 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 it's not a human contract. It's God's doing. It's God's gift. This is why I don't use the word myself, but I fully understand why some do call marriage a sacrament, because it isn't something that humans do, it's something that God does. And as that's one working definition of a sacrament. We don't somehow work magic with bread and wine so that when people consume them, they receive Christ. That's God's doing. We don't magic water so that when people are baptized in it, they are united with Christ. That's not a human thing, that's God's thing. And similarly with marriage, it isn't a man and a woman who contract the marriage, it's God who unites them and makes them one and does a new thing. And when you understand that, then you'll begin to get divorce clear. What God has joined together, let no one separate. And that's his answer to the Pharisees. It's not an answer to the question they're asking, when's it okay for a man to divorce his wife, is their question really. And he says, well, Moses allowed divorce for your hardness of heart. Moses allowed divorce because realistically, human life is tough and relationships are tough and things go wrong, and we sin and we make mistakes, and sometimes we just need to step back. And divorce may be unfortunate and it's a sad and difficult thing, but Moses allowed it because God was understanding the fact that people are weak. And that's, as may be, that's as far as the law can take us. And the law today is still in Britain, in most countries, allows a marriage to be broken because it's just being realistic, pragmatic. This stuff may well be sad and difficult, but it happens, and the law shouldn't try and force people to remain in something that isn't right for them. And we get all that. But Jesus says, you've got the wrong idea of marriage. Go back to first principles. That's what he's doing. First principles. Marriage is God's gift, God's plan, God's contract, God's covenant. Back to the old Church of England marriage service. The uniting in marriage, the two becoming one, is God's doing. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So what he's doing is challenging the Pharisees, who's saying, when can we divorce? When might divorce be allowed? And he effectively says, who do you think owns marriage? Let's step back behind the law which you're trying to interpret. Go back right to first principles. What's marriage about? It's God's plan. It's God's doing. It's not ours to mess with. It's God's. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, that's needs further explanation, which the disciples will get in just a minute in private. But it's turning round what the Pharisees are doing. You don't ask as the first question, when's divorce allowed? Like, can we write some exceptions and good old-fashioned pragmatism into our marriage law, please? He's saying, stop and think about what marriage is first. Your first thing, if a marriage goes wrong, is not how can we be divorced, or if one gets fed up with the other. in their case, the man had most of the privileges. Women could initiate a divorce and did in ancient Israel from time to time, but it was normally the man. The man's fed up with the wife. Can he choose another, a newer, younger model, whatever? No, says Jesus, you've not got it right. Marriage is not ours to make these choices. Marriage does not belong to the man. The man and his wife belong to God. That's where you start, please, says Jesus. Right, now we go into private. We don't know how the Pharisees reacted to that one. I guess they were silent because once again he's silenced them. He said, you're dealing with the wrong premise altogether. In the house, the disciples asked him about the matter, and he said, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Notice, please, Jesus is now treating man and woman as equal, which the Pharisees weren't doing. It's strong on women's lib because Jesus does treat women as fully equal with men. Marriage isn't owned by the man, it isn't owned by the woman, it's God's. And man and woman are equally responsible before God for making it work and for each other. Not always welcome news, but it's equality under God, is Jesus' view of it. How do we read this? Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, or whoever divorces a husband and marries another commits adultery. We have to read it in the light of the rest of Scripture. We have to read it in the light of Matthew, where he says, except for unchastity, probably meaning adultery. That's not the point here. See, the point here is that the Pharisees are saying, yeah, we know marriage is okay for adultery. Is it possible for other reasons too? And Jesus is saying, stop this nonsense. Marriage is from God. And now he says, whoever wants to get rid of his wife and get another one, that's adultery. And whoever wants to get rid of her husband and get another one, that's adultery. I don't think that the question of committing adultery as a reason for marriage isn't the issue here. I would take it that the committing of adultery, as is very clear in Old Testament and New, has broken the marriage. At that point, there is a valid question of whether the marriage, the covenant, the agreement, the sacrament can be healed or not. In the ancient Jewish law, it's if a man divorced his wife and he then later repented, he couldn't have her back because he couldn't remarry her because divorce was such a solemn final thing. I don't think Jesus is here banning divorce after adultery. I think adultery does potentially fatal damage to the marriage and is grounds for divorce. Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees' question, are there other grounds for divorce? And my understanding of verse 11 and 12 is someone who divorces their other half in order to get another one, in order to change partners, change models, that is adultery. If it's any reason other than that their own partner has gone off with someone else, that's a different ballgame altogether. This is if the couple are together and loyal to each other, but one just wants rid of the other for some reason, that in order and get another one, that is adultery. He's as firm as can be about that. The idea of marriage being for as long as it suits, as long as it works, as long as this, as long as that, doesn't enter it because marriage is God's gift. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff, very much more work that needs doing as we explain this and look at it in detail. And of course, go back earlier in Mark, all sins can be forgiven. And there's plenty in Mark. It's not the subject in this chapter, but it's part of the context of this chapter. Marital sin, unfaithfulness, and so on can be forgiven. Marriages on the rocks can be forgiven. Even divorce for bad reason can be forgiven. All things can be forgiven and are forgiven by God in Jesus. So if you're one or loved ones have been through such terrible times and divorce for whatever reason, it's not the unforgivable sin. He's not saying that. Please don't hear it that way. The traditional medieval Catholic Church invented these ideas of mortal sins, including adultery, as things that can't be forgiven. Well, that's not the Bible's line at all. All can be forgiven, and God's grace is bigger than anything. Moves on, because this is connected, it's part of our reading, and it belongs with it. Often people see this as a different section, verses 13 to 16, about little children. It's often used in infant baptism, and the very early records we have of infant baptism back nearly to the time of the apostles regularly use this passage to talk about Jesus blessing little children, and that's lovely. Verse 13, people were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. Oh, these wretched disciples, they're always trying to limit who can be in the kingdom, aren't they? When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. That's a very strong word. Very rarely do we hear that said in the New Testament of anyone, let alone Jesus. This makes him angry. He said, let the little children come to me, do not stop them. It is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. Took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. And that's wonderful. God welcomes little children, and churches that don't have a serious problem and need to put it right, and Christians who don't like little children in a church gathering or meeting need to think this through rather hard. Of course, there need to be opportunities for adult instruction and children's instruction and so on. But to say children aren't part of the church or only part of tomorrow's church is wrong. Jesus says they're part of the kingdom now, they receive the kingdom now, and so on. We need to work out what that means in practice. But put this together with the marriage and divorce question. As Mark puts it together, we haven't got a timing of this particular episode, same day, same place, same house, same occasion. We don't know. But Mark wants us to hear it as part of the same teaching very clearly. Because who does divorce hurt? Children. Need more be said? Not really. If children are being kept from the kingdom by parental argument, behavior, breakdown, hear Jesus' anger about that. Jesus was indignant that anyone might keep children from the grace and love of God. He was indignant. He was mightily, powerfully angry. He wants to bless little children. He wants them in security. He wants to welcome them. And he wants us to come before him helpless as little children, needing his love and grace and forgiveness. And in these matters of marriage and so on, boy, do we as individuals and as society need his grace and forgiveness. And it's there. He took up the children in his arms, laid his hands on them and blessed them. The bottom line of this, Jesus wants to bless. He gives marriage as a blessing. He gives children as a blessing. Learn from it.